Thank you all for joining KSU's Franchise Management Speaker Series and Management 4124. It includes CEOs, private equity firms, bankers, entrepreneurs, and advisors, including an attorney that we have today. We're in a classroom on the KSU campus where all the cameras face forward and in the top of the ceiling due to student privacy requirements. So it may seem like I'm looking down and by myself. That is not the case. My name is Jordan Krolick, Professor of Franchise Management. My non-professor life is as an independent equity sponsor acquiring businesses as a consultant senior leader. And today, we are extremely excited to have Mark Kirsch. Mark is a partner with Lathrop in Washington, D.C. for over 35 years. Mark's practice is focused on domestic and international franchising and distribution across a wide spectrum of industries. Mark is a co-leader of the firm's increasing diversity in franchising and has served as the chair of the IFA's Supplier Forum. He's also a member of the IFA's board of directors and is very involved with that and ABI's Forum on Franchising. Besides being noted as one of the best lawyers in America, he's a fantastic guy. And we are incredibly excited to have you, Mark, and look forward to our short time talking to you about the law and especially as it relates to the world of franchising. So thanks so much, Mark.
Well, thank you very much for having me. First of all, can you all hear me okay?
Yes, sir. It's a little soft, but it could be on my side, but I will increase the volume.
Okay, I can try to speak up. So thank you for having me. I'm pleased and honored to be here. And thank you, Jordan, for asking me to join. I've got a little bit of a slide deck that we can go through to just kind of touch on some topics. I know that Jordan's going to be asking me questions throughout the class, and I hope that the students will do so as well. So let me just before I even say that, let me say I enjoy doing this, and I'm pleased to this. And this is, as I relayed to Jordan earlier, the first time I ever spoke to a class, and I've given a lot of speeches and programs over the years, but the first time was a group of high school classes. I was a very junior associate, and they wanted me to hear to talk about franchising. So I did. And during the class, about 20% of them were really engaged and asked questions. The vast majority just kind of listened, and about 4 or 5 put their heads down and went to sleep. So because the camera's not facing you guys, I guess I can't see that, but hopefully that won't happen.
I want to say that a couple of them brought blankets.
Okay. Well, and the next time I spoke, I know this doesn't sound like a lot of high-powered speaking. My daughter's kindergarten class was doing a career day, and the teacher asked parents to come and talk about their jobs. Now, it's kind of tough to talk about franchise law to 6-year-olds, but I had 2 things working for me. One, I was following the mom who was talking about mortgage banking. And the second thing, as a franchise lawyer, I was able to bring in coloring books for one of my clients and Dunkin' Donut munchkins. Sorry, guys, this is remote, so there's no Dunkin' Donut munchkins for you guys. So anyway, go ahead. How do you want to start, Jordan?
Why don't you share your screen? Why don't you walk us through that, and then I'll intersperse questions. And as I said, the class has given me some questions in advance, and then they'll raise their hands for questions as we as appropriate.
Okay, now can you all see this okay?
We sure can, sir.
Okay, great. So again, thank you for having me here. As Jordan said, I'm a partner in the firm Lathrop GPM. I'm based in our Washington, D.C. office. We have around 350 lawyers around the country. They are not all franchise lawyers. But I can get into how I got here and what I'm doing at some point. I'm going to jump through a bunch of slides just real quickly. And some of these are topics which I know that you all have talked about in your class or will be talking about. So I don't really want to touch on it too much, but hopefully it will trigger some thoughts and some questions for you all.
We'll get them ready for the midterm.
Okay. All right. I mean, you all know, I mean, I hope you all know, franchising has been around for a long time. And some of these old traditional brands have been around for over 100 years. But what we're seeing, as you all have seen, is the proliferation of business format franchises in all sorts of product and service industries. Here's just, a handful, and you can see that they're in fitness, they're in home care, they're in healthcare, they're in home services, they're in retail, entertainment, etc.
Your slide may not have moved forward.
That's not moving forward.
No.
What are you guys seeing?
Today's topics.
Today's topics.
I am sorry. Let's see.
What I'm guessing is maybe take it out of presentation mode and do it from there and see what happens.
Yeah. What can you see now?
Franchising in the economy. You can just present it from this. This is fine.
All right, I'm not sure what happened, but okay. Sorry about that. I was talking about these.
Very, very sensitive Zoom. Do that. It's based, security and that type of thing. So we always have different.
Maybe that's it. So let's see. Can you all see the history of franchising with these traditional brands?
Yes, sir.
Okay, great. And let me just, maybe this is the best way to do it. And so, as I said, there's been a proliferation of brands over the last 30, 40 years, which is what we're talking about for franchising. This is just an example of I say 100+ industries that franchise. You can talk to the folks at the International Franchise Association. They may say there's closer to 300. Guess it really depends how you break down subsets of things like restaurants. Is it restaurants? Is it quick service? Are they bakeries? Are there coffee shops, etc.? But you all get the point. This is nothing new to you all. Franchising is a huge part of our economy, and it's only growing. And even in the pandemic, it was still growing. I just want to touch on this topic very briefly. As you probably heard, in the US, there are two types of franchises that are generally offered by franchisors: the single unit franchise and the multiple unit area development franchise. Single unit is what it says. The franchisee, get the right to operate one unit in one location. Multiple unit franchise, in terms of area development, is when you grant someone, the franchisor grants someone the right to do 3, 5, 10 outlets of the same brand in a particular territory. That's very common in the US. Master franchising, and I want to raise this, is something you don't see in the US, but you see internationally. And that is where let's take the US franchisor exports its brand to Mexico or to South Africa or Japan. Instead of being there on the ground, they grant a master franchise in which a party basically steps into the shoes of the franchisor in that territory or in that country, and then finds sub-franchisees, as they're called, trains them, gets them open, etc. Is essentially the face of the brand and the support for the brand in that location. The things that there also we can talk about, dealers and distributors. We're generally talking about today, and I think in your class, what people call business format franchises, like McDonald's or Planet Fitness, etc. But there are dealers and are distributors that are similar to franchising. When it comes to the law, and let me back up, car dealerships are a type of franchise. If those of you all familiar with the farm industry, there are heavy equipment dealers, farm equipment dealers. There's beer and wine and spirits distributors. All of those are franchising, but they tend to have their own separate laws. And so the things that we're generally talking about in franchising don't include those. And then there's also types of expansion plans using licenses that are not franchises. So That's just kind of a breakdown of single unit versus multiple unit ownership in the US. Next one. So I think you all know what a franchise is under the law. And when I say the law, we're going to talk real briefly about the laws are, but there are three elements. And the reason why I'm putting this slide out here now, the three elements: trademark license, controller assistance, and payment of a fee. And controller assistance is really critical because that's how the franchisor exercises its brand standards over the franchisee or the franchisee's business. And that's an area where it's a very low bar, low threshold to meet. And so it's easy to have a licensing arrangement or expansion plan that meets these three elements because you end up with this very low trademark control and assistance. But because of that, it also can cause some problems or challenges for franchisors. And we're going to maybe touch on things like vicarious liability, joint employer. And the issue is when a franchisor, the brand owner, wants to exercise control and make sure that the products and services are being delivered in accordance with its standards, is it exercising so much control that's now responsible for the franchisee's business. I skipped one. So franchising as we know it and franchise law really came into effect about 50 years ago. In the 1970s, after a spate of fraud in the sale of franchises, the federal government and some state governments said, we need to protect prospective franchisees. We need to protect our consumers, if you will, from this fraudulent activity. At the federal level, there's something called the FTC franchise rule. It's a disclosure only rule. There's no registration. There's no filing at the FTC. It's modeled on the securities laws, but there's no filing. And basically it says if you sell a franchise in the United States, you have to give the franchisee this franchise disclosure document with 23 items of information and financial statements and agreements, et cetera, et cetera. Then there are states who said, that's just not good enough for us. We appreciate the federal government's doing this, but we need more protection for our citizens. And so there are 14 states that have said, before you sell a franchise in my state, you need to take that FDD, tweak it according to our state laws, submit it to one of our state agencies like the Attorney General. And then once they review it and revise it and tweak it, then you can sell franchises in our state. There are also states that have business opportunity laws. I refer to them as the second cousins of franchise laws. They're also to protect investors, but they're designed to cover low investment franchises, or low investment business, but they also cover franchises. So you have to be careful about them too. The last set of laws are what are referred to as relationship laws. Again, only at the state level, about 20 or so states have them, and they're designed to protect the ongoing relationship between a franchisor and a franchisee. Things like you can't terminate a franchisee without good cause, without advance notice and opportunity to cure. You can't not approve a transfer unless you have a good reason, things of that nature. And so anyway, that's just part of the legal structure. I know you all are going to go into the details of the FDD. Here's what's in the FDD. The issue that's really important is franchisees want to know how much they're going to make. And there are things called financial performance representations. Franchisors can provide that, but they're very heavily regulated. Here's just a pretty picture of the states that are registration states. And I mentioned business opportunity states. Most of the 25 business opportunity states, franchisors don't worry about because they're either exempt for one reason or another. This is just a filing requirement. So before I get into franchise law and practice, what I do, do you want to have any questions, Jordan, about how I got here, or you want to just have me keep going?
Why don't we keep going, and then we'll kind of reverse things around at the end.
Okay, sounds good. So I'm in a firm that has a franchise practice of about 25 lawyers, which is a fairly good sized practice. And our practice and many franchise practices are divided into the litigation or adversarial group and the transactional group. I'm on the transactional side. As I like to say, I like to make love, not war. So what do? In the transactional and counseling side, we work with new franchisors and develop their initial franchise programs, working with the executives, sometimes with consultants, and we help them with their agreements, their franchise agreements, development agreements, other agreements, etc. We do the FDD, the disclosure, the registration process, and we get them ready to go. But we also do work for brands, not just startups, but mid-level, mid-size, mature brands, national brands, international brands, etc. And so our practice is really any commercial transaction involving a franchise brand. And as I say here, from cradle to grave. So it could be transfers, it could be terminations, it could be helping them develop an advertising program, it could be working with their suppliers. It could be developing or working with their franchisee associations. Another aspect of transactional counseling is businesses that are avoiding becoming a franchise or dealing with them if they are an accidental franchise. And then there's another slide about tangential work. I know I'm running through this quickly, but hopefully you'll get a picture. Because I really don't want to just run through all these things. So dispute resolution. So what is that? These are the litigators, the trial lawyers. They do litigation, arbitration, and mediation. What are the issues that they deal with? Well, franchisor, and I'll get into this. I tend to represent franchisors, franchisee and distributor terminations, enforcement of non-competes, making sure that a former franchisee is not competing with the brand. Trademark and intellectual property litigation. Trademarks are a critical aspect of the franchise brand, and so there are disputes about the use of those marks. Enforcing system standards. Is the franchisee operating in accordance with standards, using the right products, using the right services, etc. Let's see, I gotta move this down, sorry. Another aspect of our practice is international. And in the US, most international is US brands going overseas. And I say overseas, it could be Canada or Mexico, but it's also literally around the globe. I mentioned master franchising, but the way it works, you don't necessarily have to be a quote international lawyer, and you don't have to have international lawyers in your firm or have offices in foreign countries. Just like I'm an expert in franchising, there are lawyers in every country or most countries that have expertise in franchising. So if your client wants to go to Germany, we reach out to German counsel and we work with them in helping develop the documents. And if those countries have a disclosure regime or a registration regime, we work with them. And so it's a cooperative relationship to get the franchisor's brand into that country. Another area which I'm involved in quite a bit is mergers and acquisitions. It could be, and really a great deal of business occurs with private equity, and Jordan knows all about this. Private, investment firms that want to buy a franchise brand, or they want to buy a multiple unit franchisee portfolio. Perfect example is the Planet Fitness chain has many multiple unit franchisees that own 10, 15, 25, 50 Planet Fitness gyms or studios. And what happens as they get bigger, a private equity fund may want to buy them and still be a franchisee, but help them grow as part of the franchise system. And so, and then there are franchisors that want to buy other brands and create large conglomerates of franchise brands. Right in kind of your neck of the woods is Rourke Capital in Atlanta. They have a lot of brands. There's a group out of the Waco, Texas area, Neighborly. They have about 25 home services brand, Mr. Rooter, Mr. Plumber, Mr. Electric, things like that. And so what we do, either we handle the entire transaction or we just come in as special counsel for big law, the largest law firms in the country, and we provide the diligence for these deals. And then the thing that is what I find very interesting about franchise law is that there's so many tangential laws and legal issues. And here's just a list of them. And I might not do all of them. Hopefully, I don't do all of them because I'm not expert, but cybersecurity, advertising, insurance, financing, all of these things come into play because you have these, at a minimum, two different actors, the franchisor and the franchisee, plus the customer, plus other franchisees of that same brand, plus other businesses in competitive industries. So it really, it's a very interesting type of practice because you are able to touch on so many things in the life cycle of a franchise brand. I'm going to stop here because these are some of the issues I think Jordan wants to talk about. So I'll take a breath right now and take a sip of water.
Hey, that was great. I thought that was a great presentation and a great introduction to the rest. But just so they can see you, I'm going to ask you to kind of minimize that screen.
I'm just going to stop sharing.
Exit the screen sharing.
Yeah.
And I'm going to let Sandra kind of kick us off because you ended with international, and I thought she shared a great question on that.
Hi, my name is Cassandra. So my question is, what differences do you see between the domestic and international franchise cases that you work with?
Okay, I just want to restate it, make sure I heard it. What difference do I see between domestic and international franchise? You said cases?
Yeah, or situation.
Yeah.
Situation, because when you say cases as a lawyer, I think about a piece of litigation. So the biggest difference is from a legal point of view is the contracts, the master franchise versus an individual single unit franchise or a area development agreement. And so, but that really is a window into what the franchisor, the US franchisor does. And the US franchisor is going to provide, well, it's going to start with franchise development or franchise recruitment, finding the franchisee. Next, training the franchisee. Next, helping the franchisee get into a business or a location. Ongoing training, advertising, etc. I mean, that's what a franchisor is supposed to do. And the contract is between the franchisor and the franchisee. Internationally, what happens is the franchisor pretty much exports that to the master. And so the master franchisee is going to be the one who finds the sub-franchisee, provides the training, provides the support, etc. So it's a different, it's a very different structure. The US franchisor takes a much smaller percentage of the revenue. It should, because it's not doing as much, number one. Number two, it needs to make sure that the master franchisee and the sub-franchisees are making enough money to continue to do well. And so that's probably the biggest structural difference.
Right.
Does that answer your question?
That was great.
Yes.
So I just kind of, as I was listening to your presentation, I just kind of started to think about like when expanding into like an international market, like when expanding a franchise like that, what happens when it comes to like legal paper? Because there's like FDD disclosure documents and stuff like that. Like there's documents that have to be signed. What happens when there's a language barrier and like the document has to be translated into different languages, like, because a translator can have slightly different interpretations, like how do they make sure that like everybody's on the same page when there's a language barrier like that? Like the translator.
That's another good question. So the language issue and translation. In some countries, certain contracts by law have to be translated or have to be in that country's language. So that's number one. Even if it doesn't, the way the contracts are usually written, they say the governing language will be either English or the local language. So how do you know there's not going to be a problem? Hopefully you've got both sides have retained translator. Well, someone's going to pay for the translation, but both sides have retained people who read it, understand it, and there's no misunderstanding. So I'm not sure I gave you, it's a practical answer, and that is, you have to pay for the translation, and then you have to make sure it's correct. And in terms of the legal side, that's one other issue. Some countries will say you have to use our country law. A lot of international contracts, you can designate a country. The other thing that's very common when you go overseas is that you designate arbitration. I mean, there's arbitration in the US, a lot of franchisors use it. I think litigation in the court system is probably more prevalent, but internationally it's arbitration. And the reason why there are international treaties between the United States and other countries and so there are rules to how to handle disputes. And it becomes a more efficient way to handle disputes. I won't say it's efficient, and I won't say it's not expensive, because it's very expensive, but it's there's an understanding among all the parties of how it will work.
And you're switching more towards more general franchising, Kaylee? Good question,
Yes.
Mark.
My question was, in terms of, I'm Kaylee, by the way, Kaylee Hart. In terms of domestic and then the international cases you see, what's like the most common you'll see, like issues you see with domestic cases compared to international cases?
I'm not sure there's a whole lot of difference. Let's put it that way. If there are disputes, there will be similar disputes between the sub-franchisee and the master as there would between a US franchisee and the franchisor. The big difference, I would say, from a US franchisor's perspective is that they're just not on the ground. They don't see as much. And in some cases, they don't care as long as they're getting paid. And I think that's a bad approach to international franchising. Let's put aside some of the very biggest brands, the KFCs, the McDonald's, the Subways. When brands go internationally, they really need to make sure they know what they're doing and where they're going, and that it makes sense. And I will tell you that in my view, there are too many small or mid-sized brands that are going internationally and they're not ready, that they don't really have the support or the internal support structure. And so they go internationally and they say, I'll just take the big check, and whatever happens to my brand happens to my brand. And maybe that works okay, but you lose, the franchisor loses control. And so maybe this is kind of a long way around to your answer, that in the US, the franchisor is able to exercise control over the brand standards and the brand operations, and is willing to do that. And they have people on the ground, they have field support people, they can visit the 50 or the 48 contiguous states pretty easily. Internationally, they're relying on someone else to do it. And so that's where I think there's probably a difference between the standards.
And so what are the biggest issues that you think are in the industry today?
Well, there's a couple ways to look at it. One way is, what are the overall franchising and then franchisor-franchisee disputes. I think overall in franchising, to me, there is a lack of understanding of what franchising really is. A lack of understanding by policymakers, Congress and Senate and senators, as well as at the state level and the local level. And why is that important? Because there are a lot of regulations and there are a lot of laws that get passed that don't understand how franchising is involved. Let me give you an example. Whatever your policy, your ever political view is about the minimum wage laws, you know, $15 an hour minimum wage, whatever it may be. States and cities, and counties will enact laws to increase the minimum wage. And what they were doing several years ago was saying, okay, you need to get up to 15 or 18 or whatever it is over a certain period of time. If you're a big company, you may have to do that within the next 3 years. If you're a smaller business, you may have 5 years. Okay? And whatever it is, the arbitrary number, 100 employees, 500 employees, whatever it may be. But a number of states and cities were then lumping businesses that operate under the same brand as one company, as a big brand or a big company. And so you could have Joe's Sandwich Shop, which has 12 employees, you know, at the corner of First and Main, that has to implement this $15 an hour minimum wage in 5 years. And across the street is a Subway that's owned by one person. He or she has the same number, 12 employees, but he or she, as the franchisee, has to implement that minimum wage in a 3-year period of time. So they're not being treated equally. So that's one aspect of, you know, why I think it's important to have better education of policymakers. Number two, the fact that you guys are sitting here in this class is important. So as you know, when you want to, you know, that you'll understand what franchising is. And as a consumer, as if you go into finance, you'll understand that franchising, it's a small independent business, but it's part of a bigger brand. So you know how to look at that. Related to that, and I haven't gotten to the franchisor-franchisee dynamic yet, but related to that are issues like joint employer and vicarious liability. And so joint employer is a situation that says that if a party exercises control over another business's employees, both parties can be responsible for employment claims. And so let's take again, you know, Joe's sub shop, and Joe is not treating his employees properly, not paying taxes, you know, discrimination, sexual harassment, whatever it may be. Joe's responsible for those claims. If it's not Joe's sub shop, but it's Subway, and I'm not saying Subway has any problems. It could be Quiznos or any other brand. Because of the nature of the franchisor's exercise of control over the business, you know, the brand, the marketing, etc. Sometimes franchisors are now being held responsible for things that they have nothing to do with or very little to do with. Yes, they're training the franchisee's employees how to make the sandwiches or cook the burgers or provide the support, but they're not doing employment training. And so you've got policymakers and you have lawyers representing employees who are going after franchisors when they really aren't controlling them. So that's why I think it's important to understand the nature of the business. From a franchisee-franchisor perspective, there's always been tension. And it's, you know, is the franchisor doing enough for me? Yes, he got me or she got me into the business, It's now been 3 years. I'm still paying a 6% royalty. What am I really paying for? Or are they imposing standards on me that are unfair or too expensive? Or are they requiring me to buy inventory or supplies from a supplier at a price that's inflated? And I think it's unfair. So those are disputes that are always going on. The franchisees will say there needs to be better laws, more regulation. Franchisors will say there's plenty of regulation. It's a commercial enterprise. We have the right to do these various things. If someone didn't want to become a franchisee, they didn't have to. They could have started their own, Bob's Donut Shop. They didn't have to join Dunkin' Donuts. So those sorts of issues are really are evident. There's another area which I think is really important, and Jordan mentioned this earlier, and that's diversity in franchising. It's the franchise industry is just not as diverse as it could be, particularly with individuals from underrepresented groups. I will say this from studies that have been done from the International Franchise Association and others, there is a higher percentage of Black and minority ownership in franchising than there is in general small business ownership. And there have been studies that show that the gross revenues and the profits of minority-owned businesses are higher than the revenues and profits of, minority-owned franchise businesses than non-franchise businesses. But there has been a lot more that's been going on in the last, I will say, 3 to 5 years to try to address that. Franchise brands, franchisors are doing a better job. They recognize that they need a more diverse franchisee base. They recognize that they need a more diverse franchisor talent base for internally. There are lenders, finance companies and banks that are focusing on underrepresented groups and trying to provide financing, because it's not just, to me, it's not just saying, okay, franchisor is going to give a 25% discount off its initial fee, or $50,000 initial fee, you get, $10, $15, $20,000 off. That's great. But what's really needed is some discounts on ongoing fees and on the various inputs, financing or supplies, et cetera. But probably more so than that is education, mentorship, et cetera. And, because it's a whole ecosystem that needs to be addressed. So I think that's one of the challenges of franchising. And I think it's starting to be addressed.
So I'm going to flip the script with the last few minutes that we have and kind of bring it back to some basic things that I know my students have asked, which is, one would be, how do people find or evaluate or work with a lawyer?
I missed that you said, how do they find or how they work?
How do they find or evaluate or best work with a lawyer?
Okay. I mean, that's a good question. I mean, that actually, to me, that applies to any time you need a lawyer.
Yes.
So a person should go to an expert or someone with experience. I don't use the word expert. And so whether, if you're going to consider purchasing a franchise, you may know a really great real estate lawyer, but she may not know about franchise contracts. The same way that you wouldn't come to me to review your lease. So the first thing is to find someone who has expertise in that area. Second is talk to him or her and understand what their qualifications are and what their experience is. and what it's going to cost you. And there's nothing wrong with asking a lawyer, not just what is your rate, your hourly rate, but what do you think this project is going to cost? Let's assume you were to come to me and I say, I do franchisor work, but I was going to review your franchise agreement. How many hours would it take me to review the FDD, review the franchise agreement, provide you with an analysis of what the issues are, and then maybe work with you to negotiate with the franchisor? Can I do it on an hourly basis? Can I do it a project fee? So the most important thing is to talk to and communicate with your potential lawyer. And if you don't like him or her, you don't have to use him or her. And I will tell you, there are a lot of bright lawyers out there who just don't connect with certain clients. And there are certain, it should be a long-term relationship. So that's part of the issue. The other thing is, look to see, do you want to have, a solo practitioner, a small firm, a large firm? I mean, as firms get bigger, the rates are higher and the fees are going to cost more. I mean, there's just more overhead, but you tend to have more of a one-stop shop, so that if there's, literally a half hour before this class started, one of my clients that is in the home health industry, it's not medical care, but it's elder care, sent me an email and said that one of their franchisees is suspected of fraudulent healthcare billing. It's not the franchisor's issue, but it's the franchisee's issue. And they called me and they said, can you put me in touch with one of your healthcare lawyers? Because I want to understand what my risk is as a franchisor, what the risk is for the franchisee, and how best to handle this. And so, I was able to put them in touch with one of my healthcare lawyers. Yeah. If it was an issue we didn't have, then I'd say, well, I know somebody else. So anyway, that's part of it's knowing what you need and learning what you need.
Yeah, we talked a lot about defining the problem. This has been fantastic, Mark, as I knew it would be. You've had such a terrific career. I want to end on kind of a joint question here, which is, how do you personally define business success? And then what advice would you give to the students here?
Okay, business success. For me, I'll tell you why. I think I have a successful practice. And through whatever sort of metrics you look at in the law, yeah, I do. What I find very satisfying is having clients that I've had for a long time that keep, I have a franchisor client that I helped them develop, convert from distributorship to a franchise arrangement 31 years ago. And they continue to stick with me. I like that. I like feeling like I'm doing something. So that's number one, having clients that appreciate what you do. It goes, and particularly in franchise, it's a relationship business. So that's to me is how I define success. And it's kind of funny that I remember when I was a young lawyer and one of our close family friends of my father from college, he had a very successful hardware store. I know it sounds like it's a retail store. It turned out to be, they grew into multiple stores that sold decorative hardware. And I remember thinking that every time someone walked out of his store, that person was happy. They got the service they needed. They got the product they wanted. You don't always get that in the service industry. So that's how I define success: long-term relationships. Where people, you like working with the people. In terms of, advice for the students, I never had a real plan. I kind of fell into franchising. Let me just say that. And Jordan, how much time do I have? Because I could go on.
No, you got it. Just
Okay.
I would say that we're going to be wrapping it up right here with basic kind of. You can give a little background of how you got in, but I think that goes right into what advice you give to the students here.
I would have to say that if you look into the franchise industry, most people over 35 fell into it. They didn't start out their career being a franchise lawyer, a franchise executive, et cetera. Now there's more opportunity to understand it, go to classes like this, et cetera. I actually did fall into it. And so I was in a firm for a couple of years at a law school doing what I thought I would like, but I didn't really like it. And I wanted a more business focused practice, more transactional. And this firm that had a need for an associate, and I didn't really know that much about franchising, but what I liked was it's transactional. I can work with clients of all sizes, shapes, all different industries, all different types of people. So my advice, and it's grown, and over time, you know, things have changed. I've gotten involved in international. I've gotten involved in mergers and acquisitions. I deal with a lot of business people. I really like that aspect of it. So what does that mean for you all? I think it's important to try to set a 5-year plan. What do you think you want to do? And then be very receptive to tweaking that plan, changing that plan, pivoting, as people say, doing something different. But part of it is not just the industry you might want to be in. What do you like to do every day? Who do you like to work with? How do you like to interact? Because, you know, you can be happy and satisfied doing a lot of different things. And so that's, you know, that's my advice to, you know, kind of how to be successful. And I'll also tell you, I mean, I never did that. I got into franchising, and then I've been doing different things within franchising. I also was at a firm that when I first started, you know, it had a very substantial franchise practice. And then after about 10 years, we merged with another firm that also has substantial franchise practice. And then we merged with another firm. And, you know, I started in '86 in franchising. In 2007, I left a firm called DLA Piper. At that time, we had, I don't know, 3,500 lawyers around the world. I then joined a boutique firm, which some of my former colleagues, there was 5 of us, and all we did was franchise. And about 10 years ago, I joined a Minneapolis-based firm that was mid-size, small mid-size, about 160. And that's called Great Plant Moody. Lathrop GPM is when we merged 3 years ago. But I call that Great Plant Moody move my Goldilocks moment. Not too big, not too small, just right. Along the way, I've worked with some great people. So that's, you know, that's kind of my advice there.
That's awesome. Well, I can't thank you enough. I had asked for 30 minutes and you were very generous with your time to go way beyond that, and because of this great conversation. I know the class is really appreciative. And, you know, I wish you well. And by the way, you know, some of those Planet Fitness franchises that you were talking about, you can send them to me. I'm sure we can put in some money into that.
Okay.
In all reality, thank you very, very much. And the class is really appreciative too. Thank you. Yes,
Well,
thank you.
Thank you for having me. And I'm going to say this to, I mean, Jordan, you can give them my information. If anyone has any questions, I won't spend an hour talking, but if you have any follow-up questions, you have some thoughts, I mean, I'm happy to share that. And, you know, there's a lot more I could say, but I've run out of time.
Well, hey, Mark, again, thank you so much. And we'll talk very soon. And
Okay, thank you. Bye-bye.